Hello, this is the Storyteller AD, and welcome to my channel. The Tallrider. Come, and lend me your ear, that I may tell you the tale of the woman and the tall rider. This took place some time ago in olden day Mexico. It was in a hacienda. There lived a certain pretty young woman named Catalina. She worked as a servant in the house of Don Pedro, alongside her mother, Marta. Catalina was a very audacious woman that seemed to be difficult for her mother to handle. Her favorite thing to do when all her work was done was to go out to late-night parties that would be happening in a nearby pueblo called Allende. She would spend the night drinking, dancing, and even teasing men on her nights of reckless revelry. Her mother would scold her many times, but Catalina never cared to listen. Eventually, Martha managed to convince a man she knew named Juan to consider courting Catalina for marriage. Juan worked on the hacienda too. He was a ranch hand. He was also one of the best horse racers in the state. Juan did like Catalina. However, he was very hesitant to pursue her because of her teasing personality. Martha had figured that if Catalina were to become his wife, she would hopefully settle down, because Juan has broken many stubborn horses before. On the evening that Catalina was supposed to meet Juan, she decided she wanted to leave for a large party in Allende that was happening this night. Her mother tried to keep her from leaving, but Catalina brushed her aside. "Okay," her mother said. "If this is what you want, then go ahead. However, if you do, then may the devil be your date for tonight, and have you learn a lesson you won't forget." Catalina had smirked at her mother's curse, then remarked before she left, "Then I hope he's a handsome devil," to which she laughed and slammed the door on her mother. Marta then shook her head in disappointment, sitting down by herself at the kitchen table. It was an hour later that Martha heard a heavy banging on the front door. She got up to answer it, expecting to see Juan. To her surprise, though, it was not Juan. It was a man who was so tall that she had to peek under the top of the doorway to get a better look at him. He seemed to be almost at least 7 feet or 8 feet tall, dressed all in black resembling a cavalier. His grinning, ghostly pale face looked down at her, while his dark eyes, like two charcoals, shook her to the very core. He then asked her, "Which way has Catalina gone?" Martha couldn't answer right away, but stuttered and tried to close the door. However, the door was stopped by the tall man's mighty hand. "Oh, how rude. I thought you had better manners than that, Martha. Because, after all, you had asked for me to accompany your daughter tonight." The tall man's voice came sending a chill down her spine. No, Martha said. "Oh, don't worry. I'll be sure to bring her back," he said. "But whether in one piece is a different matter." He then laughed. "Now which way did she go?" "You know," Martha squeaked. "Of course I do," he admitted. "I just stopped by to let you know your curse on Catalina is being answered." To which he laughed again, turning his back on Martha. He whistled, and from out of the shadows did a black horse of immense size appeared. There was fire in the steed's eyes, and flaming sparks appeared with every step of its enormous hooves. The tall man then leapt onto the saddle, and with a cry did he rode off into the night as swift like the wind. Martha closed the door and began to pray to God that her daughter wouldn't die tonight. Catalina was some ways out from the hacienda, going through the countryside, walking on the dirt road. The sun was beginning to set, and she began to wish that someone would give her a ride to Allende. Then from behind her, in the distance, the sound of thundering hooves made her turn around. Coming fast to where she stood was a cloud of dust, being kicked up by a horse at full gallop. Catalina figured this was her chance, and began to wave down the horse rider. The horse rider then slowed the horse down, stopping before her. To Catalina, the tall rider appeared to her as a handsome, normal man, and she was quite taken by him already. "Señor, if you can find it in your heart, please help this poor damsel to reach the pueblo of Allende," she asked him. "Well, what is your purpose for going to Allende?" he asked. "Oh, I'm heading to a party that is being held down there," she answered. "Are you not afraid to be on your own during these times, señorita?" he asked her again. "No," she said. "I can take care of myself." May I then propose to you that if you would accept my invitation to accompany you? If you do, then I would like to ask you to come with me to a party that I'll be attending." "A party, you say?" Catalina said. "Is it good?" "I dare say. It causes the parties of Allende to be dwarfed by comparison to the one that I am going to. There's much merrymaking, drunken joy, exciting dancing, and all other kinds of debauchery," he answered. "Well then, I guess it would be a shame if I didn't accompany you to your party, because after all, you're willing to give me a ride. I will go with you then," she said. "Are you sure?" he said. "Of course I am," she responded back. Then grab my hand and hold tight, because I must make haste, for I am the host of the party," the Tallrider finished saying as he extended his hand toward her. Without hesitation, she grabbed his hand, in which he pulled her up onto his horse. The Tallrider then kicked the horse forward, taking off again at great speed. In no time, they had reached Allende. Rather than stopping there, they kept going through and out of the city. Catalina then questioned where he was taking her, for she had assumed the Tallrider's party was going to be in Allende. However, the Tallrider corrected her that his party was going to be at his hacienda. The hacienda was in the countryside past Allende. With that, she put her growing alarm to rest. As they traveled through the countryside, they were surrounded by many thick patches of woods and farming fields. They then made a right turn into some woods, and it became very dark, despite being a full moon out. Catalina became frightened by the dark, but the Tallrider reassured her that everything was going to be alright, although a slight grin on his face grew, hidden in the shadow of his long brim hat. It was eventually that at the end of the path, the woods opened up, revealing the hacienda, all lit up with lanterns and torches. It was a beautiful place full of lush plants and exquisite architecture. He then stopped his horse in front of the gates of his hacienda, then hopped down. He then brought Catalina down and ushered her in through the gates into the courtyard, where a great many people were gathered in excitement. The Tallrider then introduced her to the people and commenced that the party would begin. They cheered as the music began to play while wine and food were brought out. Entertainers of all sorts came out to perform before them. Catalina was excited at the vibrant spectacle around her. She was then asked by the Tallrider to dance with him, where she quickly took his hands and began to waltz with him. The whole time she was in a state of utter euphoria, passing the time with him. Eventually, the Tallrider then stopped dancing with her. He brought Catalina to a large table, figuring that she was hungry. The table was packed with all kinds of hors d'oeuvres, pastries, and fruit. She agreed, and he handed her an apple. She took a bite, but rather than being sweet, it tasted bitter with a weird chewy texture. Before she swallowed, she looked at the part of the apple she took a bite out of. She then saw that the apple was rotten on the inside, with wriggling worms popping out of it. Catalina then dropped the apple and spat out what she was about to swallow. "Oh my," said the Tallrider unapologetically. "I am dreadfully sorry. I gave you a bad apple. Here, a little bit of wine wouldn't hurt to help." He then handed her a silver goblet full of crimson wine. Catalina then hurriedly grabbed the goblet, bringing it to her lips. She poured the liquid down into her mouth, but the moment it made contact with her tongue, she spat it out and began coughing. She thought to herself the supposed wine tasted like blood. Said the Tallrider, as a wicked smile began to creep on his face. "You are just trying to drink blood right now." This was when Catalina had noticed that the music had ceased. The people around her had stopped what they were doing and begun to stare at her. Starting with the Tallrider, there was then a roaring chorus of mocking laughter. The guests' faces began to warp into disturbing and unnatural gestures as their eyes shone with a demonic gleam. A cold chill went through her as then the facade of everything faded. The beautiful hacienda she was in now faded away. Where she was truly standing was a cave that had an open ceiling. The many guests then turned to vile creatures of many sizes and appearances, dressed in ragged clothing. Lastly, the Tallrider revealed himself to Catalina his true form, with his great stature towering over her. He was horrendous to look upon, from his charcoal black eyes, his distorted pale face, goat horns peeking out from his hat, and skeletal fingers that had long nails at the end of each digit. The Tallrider looked down at her in a sadistic glee, enjoying how her face became ghastly pale. Horror had gripped Catalina's heart as she stood in frozen terror at the realization her mother's curse had indeed come true. She then attempted to run to the mouth of the cave to get out, but the Tallrider grabbed her wrist in an iron grip, and she screamed in pain because his grip was burning her. He then pulled her into him, grabbing her by the waist, while raising her up to his face so that they were eye-leveled. His hands burned her sides, while his elongated nails dug into her. Catalina squirmed in pain in his clutches. "Sorry, my dear, but you can't leave too soon. The night is still young and I have you until daylight. So let's make the best of this, shall we?" Then out of his mouth came his long tongue, and he had licked her across the face. His breath had a putrid smell that caused her to faint. As she hung limp in his arms, he began to waltz with her in the moonlight as the imps that were around him began to laugh and continue on with the party. Meanwhile, as these events were happening, Marta heard a knock at the door. She got up and cautiously opened it, and she was glad to see it was Juan. "Oh, thank God it's you, Juan," she said. "What seems to be the matter, Senora Marta? Why is there worry on your face?" "Where's Catalina?" Juan asked. "Catalina has gone out to a party in Allende," Marta said, which a look of disappointment crossed Juan's face. He then turned to leave, but Marta continued, "Please, Juan, don't go. My daughter's in danger." "In danger? What kind of danger?" Juan questioned, turning at her again. "Come in, and I'll tell you everything," she said, which Juan entered her home and they sat down at the table. Martha then began telling him all that had occurred. "Juan, I know this might be too much to ask of you, but can you please rescue my daughter and bring her home? I am scared for her safety now. I also regret placing a curse on her," Martha said, in which Juan considered her words. "Don't worry," Juan said. "Since you have always been on good terms with me, for your sake I will bring her home," Juan had said to her as he had gotten up from the table. He then hurried outside and saddled his horse, Viento, which meant wind. Viento was his famed racing horse in all of the states, then took off into the night set for Allende. Sometime later did he and his horse gallop into Allende. The streets were still teeming with city folk going about their business despite being nightfall now. He hurried to look about in the streets for Catalina, and even checked the party that was going on. He couldn't find her. Eventually, in his haste, his horse almost collided with an older gentleman crossing the street. "Oh, sorry, senor," Juan said. "Hey," the older man said. "What seems to be the rush, Joven?" "Excuse me, but I have to go," said Juan, starting to maneuver Viento around him. No, said the old man, stepping back in front of him. "I want to know the reason why you're about to run me over." "Okay, I am looking for a woman," Juan said. "Looking for a woman?" the old man exclaimed. "Take your time, Joven. There are plenty of beautiful women in Allende. Unless you are very desperate," he then laughed. "No, senor. I am looking for Catalina," Juan said, then proceeded to give a quick description of her. "Oh, yes," the old man said. "I think I've seen a woman like that riding with the Tallrider." "The Tallrider?" Juan asked. "That's what I call him." Come, the old man said. "If you plan to save her, you'll need something." Juan, confused, got down from his horse and followed the old man to the outskirts of the town. The old man had guided Juan to his wagon that was attached to a mule. He hopped on the seat of the wagon and began to say, "Joven, let me introduce myself. I am Baltazar Santos. I traveled through this country before you were even born. I have seen and encountered many things in my travels, such as the Tallrider. So what is your name, hijo?" "My name is Juan de la Vega, Senor Santos," Juan answered. "Well, Juan, the Tallrider is a crafty one and ancient, old if not older than the foundations of this world. I assume he is no more than just a form or manifestation of the devil, most likely. You might not be able to kill him, but you could fight him. So do you have any idea how to fight the devil?" said Baltazar. "No," Juan said. "Well then, you need these," Baltazar said, hopping into the back of his wagon. Juan heard him rummaging around in it. He then popped back out, carrying a well-ornamented Spanish saber and a silver-crossed necklace. "Here," prompted Baltazar to Juan to take the items from him. "Sword and a cross?" Juan questioned. "Hey, the cross of our Lord helps ward off all evil, and the sword I am giving to you is no ordinary sword. However, it is a long story about how I came to obtain it, but trust me, It'll be most beneficial for you to have." "All right," Juan said, taking the 2 items from him. Juan placed the cross around his neck and the sword at his side. "Now then," said Balthazar, "follow me," in which he grabbed the reins and flicked them, prompting the mule to move. They paced themselves very well, going deeper into the countryside. In no time, they had came to the edge of the woods, where the Tallrider has had his cave hidden. "Now, Joven, this is where I leave you," Balthazar said. "You're not coming with me?" Juan asked. "No. This task is up for you to do. I just gave you some help, but I now must be off. I have other business to attend to. Farewell, Joven, and may God be with you," Balthazar said. "What about the stuff you have given me?" Juan turned to ask, but the old man in his wagon simply vanished. Could he have been an angel? Juan asked himself. He then spurred Viento forward into the woods. Now returning back to Catalina, she had then woken up in the Tallrider's waltzing arms, and she began to struggle again. The Tallrider then dropped her to the ground and kicked her on her side, being annoyed, then told his imps to now have fun with her. They gathered around her as she screamed, while they jeered and mocked her. They proceeded to beat her viciously while clawing at her dress, giving her multiple gashes all over her body. The imps even fought with each other on who would get to dance with her first. Desperate, Catalina cried out with anguish, "Oh Lord, please save me. Have mercy. Forgive me for my trespasses against you and my mother." In response, all the demons jumped back from her as they snarled and gasped their teeth. The Tallrider walked up to her, then proceeded to reach down and backhanded her across the mouth, then said to her, "Silence, you wench. Do you know there is no hope for you? This night you are mine, and I will do to you as I see fit. He cannot help you now, so don't bother to speak his name here." Despite the Tallrider's comment, Catalina cried out again for the Lord's forgiveness and mercy. The Tallrider and his minions jumped away from her, as they all heard a shout of a vengeful man and a galloping horse. In burst Juan and his horse, with his sword unsheathed. He charged right into the host of imps, slicing and hacking at them. The ones that he smote burst into a puff of smoke, being sent back into the abyss until the day of judgment. The demons scattered, being caught off guard as they stumbled to look for the weapons to use against the uninvited guest. The Tallrider, getting over his initial shock, pulled out his sword. Then in one heavy stroke, clashed blades with Juan. Juan was not ready to receive such a jarring blow that he was knocked off Viento. However, Juan quickly got up and told Catalina to run while he holds them off. Catalina then got over her initial shock of Juan showing up too, then ran as fast as she could out of the cave while Viento followed her. Juan continued to battle the Tallrider and his imps, dispelling them left and right. Although he had struck the Tallrider several times, he didn't poof in a puff of smoke. However, he seemed hurt. Hearing more demons coming up from deep within the cave, Juan retreated outside of the cave to find Viento waiting for him. "Where's Catalina? I figured she was going to ride you to get away," Juan asked Viento, which the horse just neighed and nodded his head down the road. "This woman!" Juan exclaimed, shaking his head as he sheathed the sword and saddled his horse. He then spurred Viento into a full gallop to quickly find Catalina. It turns out, Catalina had managed to run by herself out of the woods while being cut up by the sickly dry limbs of the trees and cactuses. He found her gasping for breath next to a tree at the edge of the woods. Catalina was indeed a mess, with her dress being ripped up, covered with blood, and her hair a tangled mess full of twigs and leaves. "Catalina!" Juan said, to which she jumped. "Grab my hand and get on the horse." Catalina, with tears in her eyes, didn't hesitate. He pulled her up, holding on to her. "Let's go, Viento. To Señora Marta's house. Yeah!" Juan said, which Viento then sprung forward. During the ride, Juan glanced behind only to be astonished. Not far behind, the Tallrider had saddled his huge black horse in hot pursuit of them, shouting at them a curse. "May from the darkened sky rain down large hailstones." Then in a flash of lightning, the hailstones fell. Suddenly, the cross around Juan's neck glowed brilliantly. The hailstones turned into harmless white flower petals, falling around them. Again, the Tallrider said, "May from the bitter ground spring forth great thorns to smother my victims." Then a flash of lightning struck the ground. Then sprang up mighty thorns, thick and taller than houses did they envelop Juan and Catalina. Viento was forced to stop, then began to whine in fear. Again did the cross around his neck burst forth in light. As all the thorns turned to dust, Viento pressed forward, just in time before the Tallrider was going to overtake them. Frustrated, one last time, the Tallrider gave one final curse. "May the earth open up her mouth and swallow my prey." Then a great trembling shook the ground around them. Then before Juan and company did the earth split open to swallow them up. They then fell into the great crevice, but then the cross shone again, and did a great gust of wind burst forth, launching them back up while landing them safely on the other side. The Tallrider ceased with his curses, seeing that the Lord was with them. Eventually they entered Allende, and as they passed through it, did the townspeople look on, in shock at the strange pursuit. They exited the place, leaving a cloud of dust trailing behind them. The Tallrider made one last effort by pulling out his sword. He managed to pull alongside Juan and tried to slash at them. They ducked out of the way, and in one hand did Juan pull out his sword. They both swung their swords at each other. As the blades met, the Tallrider's sword shattered, sending a shock up the Tallrider's arm, causing much pain to him. This had caused him to slow down his horse to gather his bearings. Pushing for this advantage, Viento sprinted with renewed vigor toward Martha's house. When they had reached the front door, Juan jumped down with Catalina in his arms. He kicked the door open, rushing in along with his horse inside. Martha had risen up from prayer in surprise. Relief washed over her, seeing Juan had returned, but fear came again onto her upon seeing her daughter all bloodied up and beaten. Juan quickly laid her on the couch, then went to shut the front door. Since he broke the lock, he moved a hefty chest in front of it to hold it in place. No sooner was there a violent banging at the door. Throughout the entire night, while Martha and Juan took care of Catalina's wounds, the Tallrider taunted them, circling around the house on his horse. He could not enter because he was not permitted. Then by the break of dawn did the Tallrider call out one last time. "Now this is where I say goodbye, Catalina. I enjoyed your company. Also to Martha. Now be careful what you wish for, because I can very well appear again." He gave a horrible laugh, and his horse galloped away into the distance. In the following months after that, Catalina and Martha reconciled with each other. She had stopped going to parties and began to obey her mother more. She only ever went out if her mother needed to get something from the market, so she would accompany her. Catalina was embarrassed by her scars and suffered from nightmares of that night. She also feared that no man would ever take her in as a wife now. Despite that, Juan then eventually began to court her, then proposed marriage. Martha had told Juan that he didn't need to marry her. However, Juan countered, saying he did like Catalina from the very beginning. He figured that the man that she needed in her life has to be a strong man who understands. Martha then agreed to Juan's reasoning. It wasn't long until Catalina and Juan got married. They began a family, living the rest of their lives in peace. Although this tale ended well, beware the places you go in the countryside, or if you incur a wrathful curse from your parents, because to this very day, on full moon nights, does the Tallrider still rides, looking for another soul to torment.